Leaders, real life leaders.
If you can become aware of your own amygdala and insert a pause or know to reflect on what is the facts, as Chantel was talking about, don't speak until you've reflected on whether you have all the information, then you can be the kind of role model that you want to be as a leader.
Welcome to the Real Life Leadership Podcast, where we share real life stories from real life leaders to help you become a better leader in your organization. And we are so excited. Today we have Jeffrey Hull, who is a Ph.D. He's an author, an educator, a consultant with over 20 years experience. And he deals with C-level executives on performance leadership, change management, so much stuff. We are so excited to have him, and he has a great book that just came out this month. It's called Flex, and he's kind enough to send us an advance copy, and it is absolutely fantastic. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
One thing I love about your book is that you tell a ton of stories, and that's what we love to do here is share real life stories. And in Flex, you unpack 6 key elements that today's leaders need. And I love a great acronym, and your acronym is FIERCE. And we're going to kind of unpack those, but can you briefly explain what FIERCE is and what it stands for? Just a brief overview, and then we'll unpack it.
Sure. The FIERCE acronym was kind of the luck of the draw. I wound up in the wake of meeting that particular leader and starting to think about developing a framework for the kinds of things that needed to be focused on for the new landscape of leadership. I did an anecdotal study of my own clients and basically looked at what are the categories that I tend to work in more often and then I did a survey with the folks at the Institute of Coaching at Harvard. So taking a big, broad look at what everyone is working on these days in the executive development or leadership development space. And it just fell into 6 broad categories. One of them is flexibility, which wound up being sort of the title of the book and sort of the underpinning theory or theme of the book. It's flexibility of leadership style, and we can get into what that means, but it's basically how you make your decisions as a leader. The second is, how do you communicate? What is your intentional style of communication as a leader? How do you impact and influence through communication? The third is emotional agility, and we all know that emotions are becoming more and more present and important as a leader in today's world. The fourth is realness, or my phrase for authenticity, which involves, what's the level of vulnerability and stability and competence that you need to show, integrity, those kinds of things. And then finally, collaboration, teamwork, which is essential in today's flatter environments, networked environments, and then engagement. So Awesome. It all just kind of fell together. And I realized that my journey with my clients is to help them become fierce.
Awesome. Well, Jeffrey, we also have on today's show, we have my co-host, Heather Remick. And so I'm going to be asking you both some questions on any stories that you have on what we're talking about. And one of the tips that you talk about is taming the amygdala, and where you train leaders to tame their brain so that they can rule their emotions instead of letting their emotions rule them. So talk about what your tips are there.
Well, there's a number of different things that we all need to learn, not just leaders, but recognizing that the amygdala is that part of the brain that is the emotional center. And so it's when whenever anything triggers you, the amygdala is immediately activated. And it's what prompts us to have a fear response or a trigger response or an abrupt response. Anxiety, stress, the flight is late, whatever it happens to be. And I mean, a typical example would be one of my clients who's a Wall Street analyst and a leader of a team, a global team, doing extremely well, very successful, very high achiever. But his schedule, like many people, is literally going from one meeting to the next meeting, to the next meeting, to the next meeting. Some of them are on conference calls. Some of them are in person. Some of them are visual. Some of them, in other words, there's like no breaks. And he shared with me when we were doing coaching that sometimes if he has an upsetting meeting or something doesn't go well, he just goes right to the next meeting. And unfortunately, he gets feedback that, the facial expression, the tone of voice, the abruptness, it's like, who is this guy? Why are you say you're having a good day, but you're obviously not having a good day. And it's obvious in your tone of voice. It's obvious in the way you're reacting. And so that is typically what we call an amygdala hijack. He's under the influence of the emotions from the meeting, from the last meeting, as he goes into the next meeting. And who bears the brunt of it? The people that bear the brunt of his emotional hijack are the people in the new meeting that have no idea what's going on. So they're like, what's the deal with this guy? Why does he, yesterday he was nice, today he's being a pain. So what's going on? And he knows if he stops and takes a breath, if he realizes that it's what happened in the last meeting that's causing him to be abrupt or brusque in the current meeting. So a simple technique that we worked on was creating what I call buffer zones. A buffer zone, in his case, was a 2-minute little break that he would insert in between every single meeting where he was literally forcing himself to walk around the block, take a break, get a bottle of water, but to do something that would allow him to distill whatever emotions came up from the last session, let them go, take a deep breath, and move into the next session. And at first he said to me, oh, that's going to take hours. I don't have time for that. And I said, try 2 minutes.
I love it. Well, I will tell you, me and my husband took a marriage course together, and this girl named Kristen was talking about.
That's very courageous, by the way.
Yes. And she was talking about your amygdala.
Right.
And she said, what you can do when your spouse's amygdala gets kind of inflamed and they start having they blow up about something. What you can do is you can say to the person, here, have some of my calm. You share your calm with them.
Great
and
idea.
so one day I got really mad at my husband about something that was like silly, but I was just like, I can't believe you did that. Da, da, da. And he just all of a sudden was like, your amygdala is getting inflamed right now. I'm going to share with you a little bit of my calm, and puts his hand out. And we both started busting out laughing.
That's
It
great.
was hysterical. But I think if you can laugh about it, I think one of the things I love about Heather is that we can literally, no matter how bad of a day we're having, we literally just have so much fun because we can laugh about it. So Heather, can you talk about any time where you would say that you maybe had somebody, their emotions were instead of them ruling their emotions, they were letting their emotions rule them?
Sure. And I think a lot of times, when we think about this, we immediately think of somebody getting angry or like fired up. But a lot of times fear will guide a lot of decisions that leaders make. A lot of the decisions that people find they make in business is because of a fear of something. And so an example I can think of is, Chantel got to go and, visit a really awesome company. And she was like, oh my gosh, this company offers like all of these things. And they're offering at a different rate kind of than what we're offering at our agents. And so, we came back, we had this big retreat, and she's like, we've got to change. We have to change. This is going to be a market disruptor. It's really going to make a big difference in our area. And so we literally went off like, this is how we're really good at this. We were on autopilot. Our agents were trucking along, and we let fear make a decision that made our business so much more complex than it needed to be. It had all these if-then statements, like these people were paying this, these people were doing this, and if they did this, and they got this commission, but if they did this, got this one. And we just allowed this fear of this company coming in our area to say, we have to we have to be able to compete with them. When in all actuality, we just made it harder on ourselves for the next, 6 months than what it could have been. And so sometimes, and I think a lot of times the decisions that we make are out of fear of someone leaving, fear of upsetting someone, fear of, a change. A lot of people are afraid of change. And I think that is something that you see a lot of reactions based on is the fear factor, basically.
And I would say one of the things that for me would get me really upset I don't do it now because I've really learned But when someone would come to me and talk to me about a situation and they would get all riled up and they would be like, I can't believe so-and-so did this. And they'd come in my office and I could start taking on their emotion and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're doing that. And I'd get really upset. And what happened was, there's a great verse in the Bible, Proverbs 18:17, that says, the one who states his case first seems right until the other one comes along and examines him. And basically what that means is there's always two sides to every pancake. I have a real story of that, of one person came to my office and we give out appointments to our agents. And the first person came in, the manager came to me and said, one of my agents got a $900,000 listing and somebody took it away from them in an instant. And I was like, what happened? How could that happen? And when I realized it was because it was a commercial deal and it wasn't supposed to go to an agent that's not trained in commercial. And so that's why that was taken away. But they didn't tell me that at all. They just said it was a $900,000 deal that was taken away from them because, for no good reason. And then once I dug in deeper, I was like, oh, wow, that made sense. You're not a commercial agent. We wouldn't give you a commercial deal. And so I've just really learned that there's always two sides to the pancake, but my amygdala would go, as soon as that first person came in my office, I'd be like, what? I can't believe they did that. And I've just trained myself to know Proverbs 18:17 is right. The one who states his case first seems right until the other one comes along. And then you go, wait a minute. No, that's not actually the case.
Right.
And one of the things I tell people a lot is that, the leader is really the thermostat of the office. And so it's really important for whatever they exude. So this is a fantastic skill that leaders need to learn, because if they're somebody who constantly gets elevated very easily, everyone around them becomes very elevated. So like Chantel's story is really funny because I did call her once and I was like, I am furious. And she's like, oh my gosh, me too. And I was like, wait, you don't even know the story yet. And she said, no, you're mad, so I'm mad. And so when you walk in an office or if you walk in your team or whatever you're leading, everyone's going to adapt to the way that you're presenting yourself. So the idea of taking that 2-minute walk, like if you just came out of a heated discussion or something, before you move on to the next thing, take a lap, bring yourself back down, because that is going to carry into the next person you talk to. Everyone looks to you and they all start to adapt to the way you're reacting, and everyone gets heightened senses based on that. So
I completely agree. And I think that's, in fact, one of the first lessons that leaders need to learn when they step into owning a leadership role, is that everything's exaggerated. Everything that they do becomes a model for what other people will do. And so in the example of my client, in the past, when he would get triggered or he would have this amygdala hijack, nobody would really notice. He just got a reputation, right? Oh, he's abrupt or he's in a bad mood. But then when he became the director, all of a sudden, oh, the boss is in a bad mood. Oh, stay away. Or now I'm in a bad. Everybody's influenced by the amygdala of the boss. So as you said, if you can become aware of your own amygdala and insert a pause or know to reflect on what is the facts, as Chantel was talking about, don't speak first, don't speak until you've reflected on whether you have all the information, then you can be the kind of role model that you want to be as a leader.
Well, communication is another important topic in the book, and you say that it is a science. And you talk about the difference in leaders that motivate and leaders that alienate. Can either of you share a time where you saw a leader that motivated or alienated based on their communication style?
I mean, I can jump in and just give one quick story about someone who went from one to the other.
Sure.
Which I think is really the whole point, really. It's really the theme of my book, and it's really the theme of any kind of coaching. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book was set you up as a reader so that you can coach yourself, ideally. If you don't happen to have a coach, you can use what's in the book as a coach. But what about a leader who has a tendency to just read off their PowerPoints, right? They're giving out good information. They're having a monthly team meeting, and they want everyone to know what the budget situation is. They want people to be up to date on the statistics and on the what's working and what isn't working. And they look around the room after 30 minutes of a 1-hour meeting, and half the room is empty. Like, what happened? Well, these are all people that have worked all day. This is an evening session, and they probably stayed long enough to grab a bite to eat because the boss that I was working with was bringing in dinner, and they would even have some wine sometimes. But she started to notice that halfway through the meeting, people would be trickling out, and they always had an excuse. You know, they didn't want to be rude. She's the boss. But by halfway through the meeting, half the people were gone. And when I sat in the meeting, it wasn't that she wasn't well-intentioned, and maybe alienated is too strong a word, but because she was transmitting good information. But what was missing is it wasn't personal. She wasn't sharing, as you said at the outset, there weren't any stories. There wasn't any why, any meaning, any inspiration, why are we here? What are we really trying to accomplish? And so it was actually a very simple coaching assignment when she stepped back and reflected that she should actually think about why she's doing her job. What does she care about it? And then maybe share one anecdote or ask someone on her team to share an anecdote about something where they really felt jazzed. They really felt motivated. They were really handling a customer in a different way. And it was incredibly, it made them feel good about themselves. And it's like all of a sudden the whole thing took on a whole different light. It's like, oh, we're here to try to understand why we're adding value to our customer and personalizing it. And so it didn't really take that much of a change. But I have to say, initially she said to me, oh, people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear boring stories. I'm like, no, you know what? It's the other way around. People are actually inspired by your stories. They want to know what excites you about the work that you do every day. And then they'll still want to know the facts and figures, but including the science, as you mentioned, of communication, including the story, the anecdote, the emotion, and also the physical component, which I think is really important. You know, you need to be able to have eye contact and gestures of welcome and openness. And we won't necessarily get into all the details, but there's a way of presenting yourself if you're trying to really influence other people that is highly personal. And there's no ideal way to do it, but becoming aware of how important it is to do those little small gestures is really crucial.
Awesome. Well, in your book, I love this concept. You talk about feed forward versus feedback. Will you explain the two? And I'd like both of you to kind of give an example of some really practical ways or stories that you've seen someone actually seek and provide feed forward for our team instead of feedback.
I mean, I first want to give credit where credit belongs, which is that the concept of feed forward comes from Marshall Goldsmith.
Okay.
So I didn't invent it, and I gave full credit to him in my book. But I think it's a really powerful tool, which is that when you're looking to figure out how to improve something and you want to get feedback, but you're a little bit scared, as we all are, to get the bad news or to think that we're doing something that's not going well. We may be reluctant to reach for feedback. One way that you can do it that's incredibly motivating and also feels more less threatening, I think, is to ask someone you trust or someone that does whatever it is you're interested in hearing about, does that well. What one thing could I do differently that would improve my performance in this domain? So I'll just give you one quick example for myself. Okay. And that is that I gave a presentation about 3 weeks ago, and I happened to have a couple of very good friends in the audience. And they came up to me afterwards, and we had drinks, and they were like, oh, that was so great. You're such a great speaker. I really enjoyed it. And I said, I really appreciate that. But what I would actually really appreciate even more is if you would give me one thing that you felt or noticed that I could have done differently that might have made it even better. And I think they were a little caught off guard because they were like, oh, we didn't know you were going to put me on the spot. And I was like, well, you're my friends. Be honest with me. I want to hear. But I want one good thing. Like, what one thing? And then my colleague said to me, well, you know, Jeff, one of the things I do is when I'm using PowerPoint, I actually time how long I spend on each slide so that I don't spend too much time on one slide and too little time on another and wind up having to skip slides. And she said, you do really well because you don't read your slides, which is great. But one of the things you did is you actually skipped through some of your slides quickly at a certain point because I think you felt like you realized you were going to lose time. And I said, what a great idea. And she said, I'll send you my spreadsheet for how I time all my slides. And then you can actually set yourself up to rehearse where you time yourself, because your presentation was great, but you didn't necessarily match to the slides as perfectly as you could have. And I was like, oh my God, that is such useful feedback. So it's just a tiny example, but it felt good for her to give me something useful. And it was also really valuable for me. I call that feed forward.
Awesome. Heather, can you think of an example where you've had someone in the organization feed forward instead of feedback?
Yeah, you know, one thing I think a lot of people are afraid to do is to try new things or take on new tasks because they're afraid of the failure. And with failure comes negative feedback. You know, oh gosh, I did something wrong. And so one of the things that, you know, I really try to coach the people underneath me is that, you know, you're going to make mistakes. We're not perfect, but it's how we handle it and what we do going forward. So an example, actually, this happened this week. One of the people on our team, she took on a new task of payroll. And when doing payroll, she accidentally paid somebody who was no longer here. And so she came to me and she said, I made a big mistake. And I said, okay. And she said, yes. And she said, I paid someone who is no longer here. And I said, okay. She said, but this is what I've already done. Because she already knew what I was going to say, okay, how are we going to fix this? And what are you going to do next time to make sure it didn't happen? And because we've talked about that before and we've trained them on that, she said, this is what happened. I paid them. This is what I've already done. I'm picking up a certified check this afternoon to have the funds returned. I've already called the payroll company and they're already correcting the mistake. And for future, I've added an extra person in to check payroll to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I said, well, it sounds like you've taken care of everything you needed to. You learned from your mistake and you've set a process to take care of it going forward. And that's what you really want to instill, because we're all going to make mistakes, but it's how they handle the mistake and how they learn from it and create something better from it. So that's, I think, a perfect example where she took what would have been feedback and she put it into feed forward. She went ahead and did the feedback on herself, and then she created how she was going to change it going forward.
I love that. Well, Jeffrey, in the book, you talk about a leader being vulnerable, and this is something that a lot of leaders are terrified to do because they think they need to put on a facade for the people they lead or they will not be respected. I think this is one of my strengths. I am very vulnerable. I really am. It is what it is. I tell it all almost to a fault. So this is an area, but can you give an example of sometimes of a real story that you can think of someone that was vulnerable and how it led to more respect for the team?
I can actually think of a number of situations, and it's kind of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of leaders, especially baby boomers who may have been leading for a while, thinking that the way they did it is in the traditional way of being kind of stoic and strong and putting on a strong face for the team, which has its place. But in today's world, I think the idea of transparency and connection and being really human, like people want to trust that they know you as a human being. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? It's not about a role. It's not about your expertise. It's about you being human. Because there's so much, the media and the fake news and all of that. We've come to be very suspicious, very skeptical. And so especially young people want to see the real, true you. And here's an example of a really tough situation where being vulnerable made all the difference. So you have an emergency room doctor who runs an emergency room, right? And he's also the director of the department. And you think about it, the last thing you really want an emergency room physician to be is vulnerable. Right? When you go in the emergency room, you want him to be anything but vulnerable. You want him to be strong, confident, knows what he's doing. He knows exactly how to fix me. He saves lives every day. Well, that's all great. And the person I'm referring to, my client, was doing all of that. But here's what was happening. He was doing that in every situation. So he would do that in the emergency room, but then he would go into his team meeting as the leader and still be invulnerable, strong, competent, and know all the answers. And what did his team think? His team was like, please, what are you trying to be perfect? You're not Superman. And his feedback was not positive. And he said to me, but my patients love me. I'm like, yeah, of course, your patients love you because you're saving lives, but your team wants you to be human. And he's like, well, how do I do that? I said, well, it's a buffer zone, just like the amygdala hijack. You've got to develop that space where when you go from the emergency room, where you just helped someone with a gunshot wound, now you walk down the hall, take off your scrubs, and go into a staff meeting. And you got to be human. You got to share your vulnerability. And what happened when he did that, when he shared that it was tiring, he was stressed out, he missed his family, he hadn't seen his daughter in 3 weeks, like he just opened the meeting by saying, I don't know how you all feel, but I'm tired. And they were like, oh, thank God, finally a human being. And then they all relaxed. And then they all could be more human with each other. And he said to me later, he said, it's so much more fun to work now because I don't have to put on an act all the time. I have to be who I am with my doctor, with my patients, but I can be myself with my colleagues. And I said, and do they respect you any less? And he said, no, it's exactly the opposite. I think they actually respect me more.
Awesome. Heather, can you think of a time that vulnerability, have a story for that?
Yeah, when I thought about being vulnerable, I thought about when you said the word transparency, that's exactly what I thought about. Because a lot of times I feel like leaders feel like they have to put up like smoke and mirrors because they want everything to look like, it's perfect and, there's never a crack moment. And one of the things I think about and that happened is being transparent, especially when somebody leaves your organization. And several years ago, we had a manager in a position of one of our departments that was putting incorrect time on their time card. And I had come up here on a Sunday for something to pick it up, and they were supposed to be here. And I remember asking, "Where's your manager?" And they're like, "Oh, well, they haven't gotten in yet." Well, when I went to check their time card, they had put in that they had been there for 2 hours already, and so. We had to unfortunately let that person go. And I think what's important was that, we were really transparent with their department when that happened. And we were just like, we loved this person. They were really fun. They were a great leader. But unfortunately, they were missing one of our core values. And they were not being honest with their time here, and we had to let them go. And, I think that them seeing that, sometimes when that happens, when you have key players leave, people look to you and they're kind of seeing like, oh gosh, how are they going to react to this? And sometimes when you're like, yeah, this one, we really loved this person, but they're not here anymore and we're sad about it too. They kind of get that relief like, oh, you do, like you feel that way too. And it's hard sometimes because you want to be strong and, say like, this is why it was. But I think it's just really important to be transparent because if you're transparent, you're trustworthy and they're going to trust that you're making the right decisions and you're not just doing something because, you're the leader and you're a dictator and you can kind of do whatever you want in your organization.
Exactly.
Well, awesome. Well, there is so much great stuff in this book, and we only had a chance to kind of skim it today. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book, and it is by Dr. Hull, and the name of the book is called Flex. How do people pick up a copy of this book?
They can get it through my website, jeffreyhull.com, or Amazon or any of the major bookstores. It was in Barnes & Noble in New York last week, so
Awesome.
it should be on the shelves. But you should be able to find it at any major.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I've really enjoyed reading your book. I'm a big fan of leadership books, and this one is fantastic. So thanks again for being on our show.
Oh, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been great talking to both of you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You
Bye.
too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real Life Leadership. If you'd like to get the show notes or access more resources, log on to reallifeleaders.com/podcast to get the show notes from this episode and any other resources we might have mentioned. And also, we'd love to hear from you. Be sure to review or rate this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. And if you have any leadership questions you want answered, email podcast@realLifeLeaders.com.